This is the South African journey, a path, unapologetic, raw, and necessary.
Audiobooks offer a unique way to experience literature, making stories accessible to a wider audience.
It is one of the greatest lies of the modern age that Nelson Mandela was in prison for fighting for freedom. This myth, repeated in media and textbooks, conveniently deletes the most important fact. Mandela was a member of the South African Communist Party, SACP, and at the time of his arrest, he was not just a member. He was on its central committee. The ANC was founded in 1912, and no one was arrested until Nelson Mandela and his mob hijacked the ANC in the mid-1940s. So, we know that the white government understood the ANC and worked with it. Yes, they understood the pledges of the ANC, they accepted and opened the union buildings for dialogues with men like Sefako Makatho, John Dubé, Walter Rabazana, and Sol Plaatje. Even the British Empire opened its palaces in London to welcome the ANC leaders. The men who founded the ANC in 1912 were men of peace and vision, not violence. Violence in the ANC was brought in by Nelson Mandela and his comrades. We will look at that deep and hard, consider this very fact. In 2013, long after Mandela's global beatification, the South African Communist Party finally confirmed what had long been whispered. Mandela was a member of the Central Committee of the SACP at the time of his arrest in 1962. For decades, this was flatly denied. The goal was simple: to preserve Mandela's myth as a liberal reformer rather than a Marxist revolutionary. But the evidence had always been there. The ANC, under Mandela's leadership, entered into an unholy alliance with the SACP, an organization wholly committed to Soviet-style intervention. This wasn't abstract. Mandela co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the joint military wing of the ANC and SACP. MK's explicit aim was to launch sabotage campaigns and usher in armed revolution. Mandela even traveled to Algeria for military training, drawing lessons from revolutionary warfare and aligning himself with blood-soaked insurgents of the global left. He was not merely a political leader. He was a commander, a strategist, a covert operator in a broader Marxist war. To understand why Mandela was arrested, we must remember the global context. The 1960s was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. The United States, United Kingdom, France, and West Germany were investing their full political and financial might to prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union and China, meanwhile, were exporting revolution, not by diplomacy, but by bullets, bombs, and proxy wars. Everywhere communism landed, it brought death. Stalin's USSR murdered over 20 million. Mao's China oversaw the deaths of over 45 million in the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. Cambodia's Khmer Rouge exterminated 1/3 of its population. Communism was not about justice or freedom. It was about erasing God, family, private property, and dissent. It was about state terror in the name of utopia. South Africa, with its advanced economy and strategic location, became a target. Communists wanted to take over South Africa through violence and the barrel of the gun. Mandela and his comrades were the domestic vehicle for this vision. That's why he was arrested. Not because he fought apartheid, but because he was part of a global ideological war to destroy the West from within. What was Mandela actually doing? When Mandela was captured in 1962, he was traveling in disguise, using false name David Motsamai. He had been moving between countries, training in military tactics, and liaising with communist networks. South African intelligence intercepted documents, testimonies, and operational plans tying him directly to MK's sabotage operations. His arrest was not arbitrary. It was intelligence-led. He was not a poet holding a placard. He was the head of a war military force engaged in high-level strategic planning to cripple South Africa's infrastructure. In the infamous Rivonia trial, Mandela and others were not charged for beliefs. They were charged for conspiracy to overthrow The government using violence, guns, and bombs. Evidence presented included 210,000 hand grenades and 48,000 anti-tank mines in planning stages. A manual titled How to Be a Good Communist in Mandela's handwriting. When you read that manual, How to Be a Good Communist simply meant how to kill. Yes, detailed sabotage blueprints and plans for guerrilla warfare. These are not the acts of a peaceful protester. The manufactured saint and the death of accountability. After 27 years in prison, Mandela emerged to a world that had reshaped the narrative. Western guilt, media manipulation, and communists. Cunning merged to rebrand him as a secular messiah. The Communist Party, once working underground, walked openly into government alongside the ANC. South Africa was handed not to freedom, but to a Marxist-influenced alliance that looted the country blind. Cadre deployment replaced merit, land. Expropriation without compensation looms large. Corruption, crime, and collapse became the norm. This is not Mandela's betrayal. It is his legacy. He didn't hijack the ANC. He redirected it from its Christian humanist roots into a tool, the Global Communist Network. He buried John Dubé, Sefeko Makatho, and Sol Plaatje under a mountain of Marxist ideology and atheist revolution. What began as a call for equality ended in lies, secrets, assassinations, political betrayal, and a near-total collapse of state institutions. And at the center of that vortex was a man who smiled in front of the cameras, while he bowed in secret to Joseph Stalin, Lenin, Marx, and Mao. Restore history to truth. The time has come to strip away the myth, to teach our children not just of injustice, but of infiltration, to understand that not every freedom fighter fights for freedom. Nelson Mandela was not jailed for his skin. He was jailed for his allegiance to a bloody revolution, to an anti-God ideology, to a global network that had already destroyed nations and now set its sights on South Africa. And they succeeded. Until we tell this truth, South Africa will remain trapped in the fantasy of liberation while rotting under the real consequences of deception. Here is a personal story of violence that directly links Nelson Mandela. You cannot deny this. This is a personal experience. This will tell who Nelson Mandela is. This story happened in 1986. I was 15 when I saw her burn. They called her Gogo. An old woman, bent with years and soft-spoken, the kind who greeted you with a smile even. When her world was crumbling, that day she wasn't smiling. She was screaming. It was after her funeral. A comrade had died young, militant, angry, and the crowd was boiling with vengeance. The whispers started long before the fire. Her son is an impimpi, a traitor, a suspected police informant. And in those days, suspicion was enough to sign your death warrant. They didn't find the son. They found her instead. She was pulled from her hut like a rag doll, dragged across the gravel road. A tire was forced over her frail chest and shoulders, wedging her arms down like a sacrificial offering. Then came the petrol. Then came the match. The flames took her slowly, as if savoring the moment. I watched as fire licked her flesh, as her body twisted in unnatural agony. She screamed for her son, for God, for mercy, but none came. Only cheers, songs, raised fists. Revolution, they said. But I knew it was murder, and I have carried the smell of that burning flesh in my nostrils for 40 years. Let me not waste your time. Let me not bury truth beneath politeness or slow revelation. I will not build up to the point. I will say it now this second. This is the Nelson Mandela you do not know. Not the myth, not the monument, not the smiling statue outside the courthouse. The man, the real man, Nelson Mandela, the murderer who dressed in clothes of peace, and the man who destroyed South Africa. This is not speculation. This is not political poetry. This is truth grounded in blood, truth passed through fire, truth buried for decades beneath the propaganda machine that turned a militant revolutionary into a global saint. You see, that necklacing I witnessed at 15 wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't the chaos of a grieving crowd. It was an execution carried out by foot soldiers of the movement. And behind that movement, guiding its rage, was a system of coded letters sent from prison by Nelson. Mandela, yes, from prison. They don't tell you this, do they? They tell you he was silenced, powerless, a peaceful giant locked away from the world. But the truth is, Mandela was never voiceless. He wrote constantly letters, messages, instructions. Some smuggled in, some smuggled out, some written in code. Some read only by the initiated. The ANC of Mandela was not the ANC of 1912. It had been hijacked, twisted from a Christian liberation movement into a revolutionary machine fed by Marxist ideology and lubricated by blood. And Mandela, charming, articulate, and camera-friendly, was its untouchable spiritual commander. The orders were clear: intensify the struggle, punish traitors, send a message. That message arrived at my doorstep in the form of a burning grandmother. This book is not written in hatred. It is written in grief. Grief for a nation that was seduced. Grief for the children raised on lies. Grief for the dead whose names are not inscribed on marble walls, but who scream from unmarked graves and scorched townships. If you came here expecting another hymn to Mandela, close this book now. If you came here to defend your illusions, you will not last long. But if you came for truth raw, unsanitized, and hard as stone, then read on. Because the greatest deception ever sold to the world is that Nelson Mandela was a man of peace. He was not. He was a man of coded orders, targeted killings, and orchestrated fear. He was a man of smiles for the camera and fire behind the curtain. The republic he was hailed for saving, he quietly sabotaged.
Chapter 1. The Quiet General Mandela's Shadow. War from Prison. They say prison breaks a man. They say when the bars close and the keys jingle into the darkness, a man's influence vanishes, his voice fades, his reach withers, his authority dies. But they were wrong about Nelson Mandela, because prison did not silence him. It crowned him, the myth of isolation. From the outside, the world wept for him. The lone prisoner, the black messiah behind concrete walls, breaking rocks under the Cape Town sun. They told stories of a broken man with a noble spirit, hands blistered, voice muzzled, heart full of forgiveness. A gentle old man in a cell. But inside that cell, something far more calculated was happening. Mandela was not passive. He was strategizing. He was not cut off. He was communicating. He was not forgotten. He was ascending with every passing year. Mandela's public silence amplified his spiritual aura. He became myth, martyr, and messiah rolled into one. But behind the veil of heroism, he was building an empire of fear, one smuggled letter at a time. The network of secrecy. Mandela didn't need a gun. He had disciples. He didn't need to shout. He wrote, "The ANC transformed from a Christian liberation body into a clandestine revolutionary syndicate depended on coded communication." And Mandela, deep inside Robben Island, had mastered the art of the invisible hand. A word in a letter could mean a name. A phrase about resolving community tensions could mean assassination. A poetic sentence could be an encrypted death sentence. His messages moved through trusted comrades, lawyers, priests, family members, and operatives trained to extract meaning from metaphor. Each line double-coded, each sentence a signal, each paragraph carrying orders, veiled as philosophy. And they were carried out with terrifying accuracy. The rise of the death list. It was during the mid-1980s that the ANC began assembling what insiders called the list, not of enemies in government, but of internal threats, informants, dissenters, critics, suspected collaborators. Some were guilty, most were not. But in the eyes of the movement, suspicion was sufficient. People's courts were held in dusty corners of the townships. No lawyers, no appeals. Just mob chants and burning tires. And behind this wave of terror, a doctrine of necessary violence crafted, refined, and spiritually justified by letters from Mandela and his inner circle. The gentle words that killed. Take, for instance, one such letter seemingly innocent. We must intensify our resistance against the underminers of our noble cause. It is important that the people themselves rise to defend the revolution. The struggle is long and bitter, but it must be waged from every corner of our land, without fear or hesitation. To an outsider, this sounded like poetic resistance, but in ANC parlance, this was an operational directive. Underminers meant suspected traitors. Rise to defend meant conduct people's justice. Every corner meant townships. Letter passed from hand to hand until it reached the right comrades. And within days, a woman was dead, burnt to ashes, burned alive by her own neighbors. Her crime? Her son was rumored to speak to a cop. This is how Nelson Mandela outwardly imprisoned. Inwardly, exalted ran a war of ghosts. He didn't need to scream. The ANC's terror machine heard every whisper in his letters. The double life of a saint. This was the paradox the world never questioned. How could a man whose name echoed through churches and courtrooms also be the ghost author of a township purge? How could the man who later shook hands with the Pope and Desmond Tutu be the same man whose letters triggered the deaths of ordinary Gogos, old women? The answer lies not in his words, but in his timing. Mandela, a master of optics and long games, understood something many revolutionaries forget. Softness must follow fire. He allowed the movement to carry out the violence, then emerged from prison as a man of peace. The world gasped at his forgiveness. But forgiveness is easy when the graves are already full. Robben Island was not a cage. It was a command post. What most don't understand is that prison gave Mandela exactly what he needed. Mythic status without accountability. Moral authority without dirty fingerprints. Time to plan. To watch. To orchestrate. From his cell, he became not a victim, but a strategic prophet. His silence more powerful than any slogan. His letters more dangerous than bullets. The ANC on the outside needed his mystique. The terror on the ground needed his legitimacy. And when the fires had done their work, the man emerged like a dove with ash on his wings, and the world applauded. But some of us remember the screams. And so begins the unmasking. This chapter is not fiction. It is the beginning of a long excavation. You have heard Mandela's public words. You have watched the state-funded documentaries. You have seen the statues in school books. But here, you will read the shadow side, the war no one recorded, the instructions written in ink and blood, the Mandela they never wanted you to know. And when you see it all, when the mask is fully removed, you will understand. The man who burned with the fire of vengeance walked out in clothes of peace, but the fire still burns. Chapter 2. The death of the Christian INC. Before the guns, before the slogans, before the statues and the exile, and the camps, there was a church. Not a bomb. Not a manifesto. A church. ANC was born in prayer. The original African National Congress was not forged in Moscow, but in Methodist pews, Presbyterian mission houses, Anglican pulpits, and Congregationalist circles. It was a moral movement, a Christian covenant formed by educated black men who believed in dignity, order, family, nonviolence, and above all, God. It was not perfect, but it had a soul, and that soul died long before. 1994. A movement built on scripture, not slogans. The names are not shouted in stadiums today, but they are the true fathers of the ANC. John Langley Bali Dube, Reverend, teacher, founder. Solomon Plachi, translator of the Bible, chronicler of black pain, fluent in African and European tongues. Sefako Makgatho, Methodist, unifier of modern African elites and traditional chiefs. Pixley Kassim, lawyer, philosopher, advocate of African Christian values. Dr. A.B. Zuma, Dr. James Maroka, Walter Rubusana, Christian patriots. These men did not believe in class war or armed struggle. They believed in moral persuasion, reason, petition, negotiation, and if need be suffering with dignity. The ANC they built was rooted in biblical ideals, the dignity of every human being made in the image of God, the necessity of justice with mercy, the rejection of vengeance, the sanctity of life, the importance of restraint. They saw their cause not as a revolution, but as a moral testimony against the sin of racial domination. They spoke in the language of Christ, not of Karl Marx. And their dream was not a classless utopia. Their dream was a reconciled South Africa where all races could dwell together under the fear of God, enter the poison, but every holy temple eventually faces a serpent. For the ANC, the serpent came slithering. In the 1940s, with whispers of class struggle, with promises of global revolution, with theories forged in the atheistic laboratories of the USSR, at first, it was subtle. Communist Party members began to infiltrate leadership structures, offering resources, foreign connections, and revolutionary clarity. They promised the ANC a faster path to liberation, one that would not rely on slow Christian appeals to conscience, but on action, violence, agitation. They mocked the church as weak. They ridiculed Christian leaders as naive. They introduced the vocabulary of Lenin, bourgeois, proletariat, dialectic, class enemy, and Mandela brilliant, ambitious and restless was seduced. Mandela's rise, the spiritual turning point. Nelson Mandela did not join the ANC to preserve its Christian roots. Joined it to remake it. His personal break with the Christian tradition was not accidental. It was deliberate. He left his devout wife, Evelyn Mays, a deeply religious woman. He rejected her Bible-centered worldview and chose instead the secular militancy of Marxist thought. In his own reflections, Mandela admitted this as a time of moral drift. It was more than drift. It was ideological conversion. Mandela did not stand on the shoulders of John Dubé and saw Plateau. He walked away from them. He joined forces with communists, entered into alliance with the Soviet-backed SICP, and began reshaping the ANC's identity from Christian conscience to revolutionary cadre. The turning point came with the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the ANC's armed wing. Here, Mandela abandoned even the pretense of nonviolence. The founding manifesto of MK declared that all peaceful avenues were exhausted, lie that dismissed decades of faithful Christian resistance. And so the ANC's baptism was revoked. Its soul was traded for strategy. Its Bible replaced with Thebrel of the gun. Its moral code rewritten in the language of revolution. The betrayal of the church that birthed the ANC, watched in horror. Some leaders compromised. Others were sidelined. Many went silent, afraid to challenge the new gods of armed struggle and ideology. The movement no longer gathered to pray. It plotted to kill. The ANC's Sunday sermons turned into revolutionary anthems. Its internal debates became tribunals. Its Christian values became obsolete, even dangerous. Those who dared to call for restraint, peace, or forgiveness were labeled sellouts. Most were expelled. The ANC of Mandela's generation had no room for such men. And the greatest tragedy? The world applauded as the soul was butchered. By the time Mandela was freed, the ANC was unrecognizable by the time Mandela emerged from prison in 1990. The ANC was no longer a Christian movement. It was a political machine run by ideologues, thieves and exiles who had lost all contact with the moral roots of the struggle.
Communism has got nothing in common with African values of growth and patience. Communism seeks to destroy what is there. African values and traditions are predisposed in the natural order of things that change by evolution, steeped in spirituality. Everyone knows that communism is a godless monstrosity. African values respect and nurture the idea of a family. Communism sees the family as the enemy, for it seeks control of the people. To have a family and parents in control of their children is against communism. Communism wants to control and support those children, give them social grants. African values appreciates the spirit of enterprise and individual creativity. Communism is about equality and collectivization. So Nelson Mandela abandoned African Christian values and got baptized into the religion of godless communism. That is what it is. He literally and openly denounced African Christian values and, according to his words, went on a path of an immoral life. This is what he said himself. He divorced his wife Evelyn because she was a Christian. That is exactly what Mandela says in his Long Walk to Freedom book. The ANC was founded by men and women of Christian faith. There was no communism in the midst of the ANC. The ANC was founded in 1912 in Bloemfontein by Christians. The event opened up with prayer, not a mandala. They were gospel songs in the midst of the speeches. The atmosphere was of calm, wisdom, and prayer, not fiery rhetoric. And that continued for 3 decades until that Nelson Mandela appeared and crushed this spirit. Drunk with the fiery communist spirit was destruction, Nelson Mandela set himself diametrically opposed to those who built the ANC, those who came ahead of him. He became a pupil and student of communists like Joe Slovo and was like a puppet used by these communists to enter into the realm of Africans' worldview and tear down African values and replaced with communism. And that is where we are now. That is where South Africa is now, ruled and governed by communist ANC. Let me repeat, communism has absolutely nothing in common with the core of African values, where African tradition teaches growth, patience, respect for the spiritual order, and evolution through wisdom. Communism charges in like a wrecking ball. Its very essence is destruction. Communism does not build, it dismantles. It does not nurture, it seizes and controls. African values are rooted in spiritual consciousness. They honor family. They uphold the dignity and sacred role of parents, elders, and community. In contrast, communism views the family as an obstacle to the control it seeks. It aims to control the soul of the youth, reshape them through ideological manipulation, and erase the inherited wisdom of their traditions from family. Let it be known, Nelson Mandela turned his back on African Christian values. He did not walk the path of our forefathers. He denounced the morality of his Christian upbringing and publicly confessed to adopting what he called an immoral life. These are his own words in Long Walk to Freedom. He left his wife Evelyn because she was a devout Christian. That is a fact. That is his words, and that is the path he chose. The ANC was not born of Marxist fire. It was born of Christian faith and African dignity. Founded in 1912 in Bloemfontein, the ANC's birth was wrapped in gospel hymns, prayer, and wise deliberation, not in militant slogans or ideological warfare. For 30 years, the ANC was a place of spiritual resolve, moral clarity, and unity in vision. Then came Nelson Mandela, and everything changed. Drunk on the doctrine of destruction, Nelson Mandela did not continue the legacy of the founders. He betrayed it. Under the influence of communists like Joe Slovo, he became a vessel, a puppet, a carrier of foreign ideologies designed to tear down African spiritual worldview. He was no longer walking in the steps of Sefako Magatho, John Dube, Pixley Kaseme, and Walter Rabusana. He was marching to the drumbeat of Karl Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and with him came the slow poisoning of African values in South African governance. This is why today, South Africa is ruled by this ANC. An ANC that sees people as beneath them, deliberately go on course to block their progress and development so that they are able to control them through social grants dependency. This is not progress, having almost every black child hooked on social grants. This is not freedom. This is cultural suicide. More than 60% of kids are fatherless because communism says you must free the human body from morals. That is one of the tenets of communism if you do not know. It says be free, go out that and enjoy yourself. Communism is anti-family, anti-spiritual, anti-moral, and those who led us into its arms turned their backs, not only of Christianity, on the soul of African values.
Chapter 3. The cult of the slogan, How Mandela's Myth Produced a Nation Without a Moral Compass. He walked out of prison in 1990 with his fist raised and a smile sculpted by silence. Nelson Mandela. Saint statesman, symbol. He did not weep. He did not rage. He performed. It was theater for the ages. And with that smile, that calm voice, that quiet strength, the world sighed in collective relief. The Messiah had emerged. The struggle had ended. The future had arrived. But behind that smile, something dangerous had just been born. A myth, powerful enough to enslave a nation's thinking. A persona, crafted to bury a blood-soaked past, and a cultural blueprint that would give birth to a South Africa addicted to performance over substance, slogans over truth, and race over morality. The nation becomes a stage from that moment forward. South Africa was no longer governed by truth. It was governed by optics. Rainbow nation, reconciliation, better life for all. Non-racialism, kill apartheid once and for all. Struggle continues. These phrases weren't truths. They were masks. Beneath them, the ANC quietly entrenched a new aristocracy of the party elite, a kleptocracy cloaked in liberation credentials. But the people didn't notice because they were too busy chanting, singing, celebrating Mandela. They didn't get a better life. They got a better sounding lie. Mandela the myth versus Mandela the man. The real Mandela was complex, a man who believed in controlled violence. Man who gave moral cover to township executions. A man who made peace with his jailers but kept silence on his comrades' atrocities. A man who allowed the ANC to rot while he polished his saintly image. But the Mandela myth was simple. He was peace incarnate. He saved us. He brought democracy. This myth became national gospelland. It killed critical thinking. It trained a generation to revere symbols, not ideas. It bred emotional obedience, not moral discernment. And so, the youth inherited empty slogans in place of history. They were raised on selective memory. They were taught to worship an image while ignoring the consequences. The rise of the blame economy. Because Mandela never truly confronted the ANC's internal rot, because he never confessed the movement's Marxist infiltration, its abuses, its race, purges, its betrayal of Christianity. A new generation was born into a vacuum of responsibility. And into that vacuum came a weapon. Race, politics. The party that had taken power through deceit now maintained power through guilt. The past was weaponized. The youth were trained to blame. The white man became the eternal scapegoat. Kill the Boer. Kill the farmer. Land theft, inequality, unemployment, crime. It was all the legacy of apartheid forever. But here's the truth. Oppression died in law in the year 1994. The ANC has ruled uninterrupted ever since. Yet they still blame. And why? Because blame prevents accountability. It is the perfect distraction. And Mandela's myth, so pristine and untouchable, became the shield behind which the thieves could operate. They knew the people would never turn on the party of Mandela. So, they looted with impunity, they governed like kings, they lived like gods. While the poor were handed slogans, t-shirts, and graves. A generation raised on noise. Today you see the result. Children who can chant a Mandela, but can't quote the 10 Commandments. Streets renamed for struggle. Heroes, while the schools that line them fall apart. Entire communities reduced to slogans, comrade, fighter, cadre, while their taps run dry and their clinics. Rot. This is Mandela's unintended legacy, a cult of performance, where the optics of revolution replaced the substance of morality. The country was spiritually orphaned, its soul removed, its history rewritten, its future mortgaged. What Mandela? Never taught, he taught us to forgive. Only to pacify, but he never taught us to repent. He taught us to reconcile, but he never taught us to reform. He taught us peace without confession, unity without truth, healing without justice. And in doing so, he left a wound bandage, but never cleaned. The infection festered beneath. And now it spreads. The lie was not the only problem. The silence was worse. Mandela's silence about ANC atrocities was not neutral, it was strategic. He did not denounce the necklacings. He did not weep for the murdered elders. He did not expose the communists within his ranks. He did not rebuke the cadres who were already preparing to loot the state. He remained silent, and his silence became policy, a cultural norm, a leadership model. Today's ANC leaders inherit not only his name, but his technique. They smile. They speak of peace. They quote scripture. They wear Mandela shirts. But behind them, theft, failure, corruption, decay. And so the fire spreads. The fire of soul sickness. Passed from Mandela to Mbeki to Zuma to Ramaphosa, not by ideology, but by silence, spectacle, and moral collapse. And today, South Africa stands as a broken nation, rich in slogans, poor in truth, crowned in myths, bankrupted in conscience if the nation is to heal. The myth must die. We must speak plainly. He handed us slogans and buried our soul. If South Africa is to rise again, we must bury the myth and resurrect the truth. Mandela was not a god. He was a man, and he made choices, and those choices created this collapse. Until we say that out loud, nothing will change. Chapter 4, Global Worship, Local Collapse. How the world's love for Mandela helped destroy South Africa. The world loved Nelson Mandela. They lit candles in London. They sang in Times Square. They wept in Berlin. They named streets, schools, statues. They printed his face on mugs, stamps, coins. To the Western world, Nelson Mandela was a cross between Gandhi and Christ's long-suffering, noble, forgiving. A man who walked out of prison with no bitterness and offered his oppressors a seat at the table. He was everything they wished for in a post-colonial African leader. Non-threatening, polite, eloquent, civilized, not angry, not vengeful, just beautiful. But while the world clapped and cheered, something horrific happened back home. The Ankh turned South Africa into a carcass, and the world, so mesmerized by Mandela's myth, looked away. The Mandela illusion becomes a shield. Mandela became more than a man. He became a brand. Every photo op, every handshake with a former enemy. Every speech about reconciliation was amplified, romanticized, repackaged for global consumption. Foreign dignitaries poured into the country to kiss his hand, give honorary degrees, kneel at his image. Meanwhile, Eskom began to rot. SOEs were looted in silence. Tender mafias were born. Whistleblowers were killed. Cadres replaced. The moral fabric of institutions was torn apart, but the media wouldn't report it. The diplomats wouldn't raise it. The global powers wouldn't criticize. Because criticizing Mandela was taboo. To question Mandela's rule or even what his silence enabled was seen as sacrilege. To challenge the ANC was to be accused of racism. To tell the truth was to invite exile. So the global worship of Mandela became a weapon of silence. And in that silence, the new rulers fed. While Mandela dined in Oslo, Gogo starved in Soweto, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He sat next to popes, presidents, prime ministers. He flew first class while millions walked barefoot. He gave speeches in palaces while township families sat by candlelight. He traveled the world, but he did not tour the pain of his own people. He did not return to the families of those necklaced in his name. He did not publicly rebuke the comrades who had become gangsters in suits. He did not lead a moral reckoning in the ANC. He did not weep on national television and call for truth. Instead, he posed for photographs. He became the famous grandfather of global reconciliation. while his political children back home looted every structure of the state. The global stage drowned out the national reality, while the BBC interviewed him. Clinics collapsed, while CNN replayed his speeches. Farmers were slaughtered, while he was praised in the UN Assembly. The schools became drug dens. While statues were raised in Paris, the youth in South Africa lost all memory of the true ANC of 1912. And nobody said a word. Why? Because Mandela had become too big to fail. He was the West's redemption story. Proof that Africa could produce a leader who forgives. To question him was to offend the carefully crafted fairy tale of post-apartheid hope. But back home, truth was bleeding in the street. The price of being the world's Saint Mandela's global sainthood came at a devastating cost. It silenced local critics. It gave cover to internal rot. It disarmed international pressure. It deformed the ANC into a cult. Even when he stepped down, his aura lingered. His successors wrapped themselves in his memory while they buried his conscience. Thabo. Mbeki built a shadow empire of aloofness. Jacob Zuma brought the vultures. Cyril Ramaphosa smiled while the lights went out and through it all. Mandela's face remained the wallpaper of legitimacy. They invoked his name to justify their power. They wore his shirts to clean their crimes. They used his legacy to escape scrutiny. The world saw a rainbow. We lived the storm. To the foreign observer, South Africa was a miracle. To us, 'twas a betrayal. They saw Madiba magic. We saw missing textbooks. They saw dancing in doves. We saw joblessness and junk status. They saw forgiveness. We saw selective amnesia. And while the world continued to praise Mandela until his final breath, many South Africans privately began to whisper, "We love him, but he let us down. He forgave the white man, but he forgot the black poor. Made peace with our enemies, but not with our pain." Chapter 6. The Spirit of the Lion Mosquing, the Soul that Rules the ANCU. Must understand something now before we go any further. This book is not merely about politics. It is not even primarily about Nelson Mandela or the ANC as a party. It is about something far older, far darker, far more real than most dare to believe. Because there is a spirit behind this movement, and it is not simply misguided, it is wicked. Not in a poetic or metaphorical way, not as an exaggeration, not as rhetoric. This spirit is real. It is Luciferian in essence and operation. Yes, I said it, and no, I do not take it back. This is not for effect. This is reality. The ANC does not believe in truth. Begin plainly. The ANC does not believe in facts. They do not submit to reality. They do not engage with what is provable, historical, or grounded. Instead, they believe in narrative, in constructed perception, in social engineering, in the repetition of lies until they become law. You can show them maps, timelines, birth records, battle dates, economic graphs, or DNA samples. You can recite documented events, quote founders, cite the original mission of the ANC itself, and they will still say, no, that is not our truth. They believe truth is whatever they feel or want to be true. They believe that if they say it long enough, violently enough, and through the mouths of enough paid intellectuals, it will override reality itself. This is not mere ideology. This is Luciferian arrogance, the belief that truth can be manufactured, that reality can be overwritten by desire. That man is God, the spirit that rewrites reality. What do you call a spirit that looks truth in the face and says no? What do you call a consciousness that would rather invent than accept? What kind of spirit takes the builders of South Africa for Afrikaners, missionaries, Khoisan traders, Indian merchants, Black Christian visionaries, British administrators, and erases them from the story? What spirit says, History is what we say it is. The past is colonial propaganda. South Africa was built by the struggle and no one else. What kind of spirit can look at failure and call it success? Can see corruption and call it liberation? Can collapse a power station and blame apartheid? Can destroy schooling and say we're transforming the curriculum? Can murder whistleblowers and speak of democracy? There is only one spirit that fits this profile, the spirit of Lucifer. This is not metaphor, let the reader understand. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetic emphasis. This is theologically, morally, spiritually real. Lucifer, the fallen angel, was the first revisionist, the first to question God's authority and claim he could construct a new order, a higher truth. He did not rebel with an army first. He rebelled with a lie. He did not kill first. He deceived. He did not overthrow. By force, he distorted. And what is the ANC's operating system today? Distortion, denial, deceit, self-exaltation. They twist the story of South Africa like Lucifer twisted the purpose of Eden. They take what God designed for good history, nationhood, unity, and twist it for power. This is Luciferianism in practical governance. The mark of this spirit will always know this spirit by its fingerprints. It exalts itself above truth. It says, I know better than the facts. Chooses beautiful words to cover ugly actions. It says this is liberation, while killing the soul seeks worship, not accountability. It raises Mandela to God status. It speaks of the ANC as eternal. It turns political parties into objects of spiritual loyalty. It hates the word of God. It rewrites moral law. It despises biblical justice. It replaces repentance with blame and humility with racial revenge. It cannot build, can only destroy and rename. Every city, every institution, every heritage site it destroys, loots, then renames it after struggle heroes. Nothing is built, only rebranded. It feeds on memory loss. It hides history. It deletes archives. It trains the youth to hate what built the country and worship what broke it. This spirit must be confronted, and this spirit is named. It cannot be confronted. You cannot reform this. You cannot debate with it. You cannot vote it out. You cannot negotiate with a lie that believes it is God. You must do what Christ did in the wilderness. You must confront it with truth. And that truth must be unafraid, unapologetic, unbowed. We are not fighting men. We are fighting a spirit, let it be said plainly. The crisis in South Africa is not just political. It is spiritual. It is not merely about bad governance. It is about the infection of the serpent, the same serpent from Eden, now slithering in the halls of government, in the slogans of revolution, in the curriculum of lies, in the mouths of men who wear suits while planning theft. This is not politics. This is war on reality itself. And until we recognize that, we'll always treat symptoms instead of the disease. The cure is not in politics. It is in truth. The lie must be exorcised. That means restoring the true story of South Africa, reclaiming the Christian foundations of the nation, teaching our children what really happened, refusing to participate in the culture of narrative over fact, speaking truth even when it offends, praying not for political victory, but moral clarity and spiritual cleansing. This is not a campaign. This is a deliverance. Final word: the ANC is not just a failed party. It is a vessel for a spiritual deception that began long before Mandela walked out of prison, and unless that deception is cast down, South Africa will never rise. We are not just in a constitutional crisis. We are in a cosmic confrontation, and the time for polite silence is over. Chapter 7. The High Priest of the Lith, Case of Nelson Mandela, the world's pastor, and communism's servant. There are lies, and then there are performances so rehearsed. So decorated, so globally adored that the world forgets to ask whether they were true in the first place. Nelson Mandela did not just tell a lie. He lived one, and not an ordinary lie. Not a broken promise or a misleading speech, he lived a grand deception. One that spanned continents, seduced billions, and rewrote the moral identity of South Africa. He became the high priest of a false gospel. The gospel of tolerance without truth. Of reconciliation without repentance. Of godless revolution dressed in priestly robes. Does he even have a conscience? Ask yourself, what kind of man can look the world in the eye, stand on podiums surrounded by presidents, cardinals, archbishops, spiritual leaders, elders, and children, and still hide the most dangerous truth of all? What kind of man can walk side by side with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, laughing under sunlight, lighting candles, bowing his head for prayer, then turn around and viciously resist the inclusion of God in the preamble of the Constitution? What kind of man leads a global audience to believe he is a Christian while ruthlessly crushing Christianity inside the ANC? Does he even have a conscience? Or did he sell it? Because what he did was not an accident. It was a calculated orchestration of spiritual fraud. The Archbishop and the attack. The year was 1996. A new Constitution was being born, hailed as one of the most progressive in the world. A moment of legal and moral rebirth. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in his moral innocence, made a request. A simple request. Let the preamble begin with, "In the name of God." He was not asking for a theocracy. He was asking for a moral compass. National recognition that this country had a soul, that the thousands who had died in both the struggle and the streets were not just political bodies, but spiritual lives. But Mandela said no. No to God in the Constitution. No to the spiritual roots of the country. No to the moral heritage of the country. No to the moral heritage of the Cornish. I can't look at this. And we all know I've been exploring that Cornish. But we all know I've been exploring that path. But spiritual lives, but Mandela, may I kate to my cat-toss with angst founders. No to the prayers of mothers. No to the legacy of Christian chiefs. No to the black churches that had carried the people through apartheid. And not only did he say no, he did it with fury. He turned on Tutu with sharpness. He rebuked him. He made it clear the Constitution would be secular, not sacred, that this was not neutrality. This was hostility, the spirit. Behind the smile, Nelson Mandela knew what he was doing. He was not a confused man. He was not trying to balance faith and politics. He was a trained Marxist, disciplined in communist doctrine, loyal to the SACP, connected to Soviet operatives, and committed to erasing God from state affairs. His communist training taught him one core rule: religion is the opium of the people. It must be contained, diluted, or co-opted. But he couldn't say that out loud, so he smiled. He walked with priests, he spoke at churches, he performed holiness while pushing a system of godless. This is why he refused to include God in the Constitution, because the ANC he led into power was no longer the ANC of John Dubes, Sefako Magatho, and Sol Plaatje. It was the ANC of Moses Kotane, Joe Slovo, and Marx. To Mandela's, the inner and the outer, there were always two Mandelas. The inner Mandela, the revolutionary, the communist, the man who authored the 1950s alliance with the Soviet Union, the man whose private writings showed disdain for Christianity as a force of weakness, the man who praised Fidel Castro, Gaddafi, and Arafat, the man who protected cadres who looted, burned, and killed, the outer Mandela, the pastor, the reconciler, the Sunday suit, the prayer partner of Tutu, the friendly grandfather, the model of forgiveness, the voice of peace. The world saw the outer man, but South Africa paid for the inner one. He stood before 7 billion as a saint hand. That is the most frightening part. He knew the world was magnetized by him. He knew they would believe. Whatever he said, he knew no one would dig beneath the robes. He knew the cameras would capture. Only the smile, not the silence behind it. And so he led the world in worship. Chapter 8. This is what it means, the deeper truth behind the firelet. Us step back for a moment, breathe, because what you've just read is not easy. It wasn't meant to be. The fire of truth should burn, but it should also light a path. You've heard things in the last chapters that most South Africans have never dared to say out loud, let alone write. You've walked through deception, betrayal, spiritual masks, and constitutional fraud. You've seen Nelson Mandela, not the saint in bronze, but the strategist in shadow. And now, with all the noise momentarily behind us, the question rises, like a voice in the silence. So what? What does all of this mean? Do we just gasp, shake our heads, and scroll away? Do we feel scandalized, only to forget tomorrow? Do we cry betrayal, then carry on like we were never told? Oh, this is not tabloid rage. This is not scandal for entertainment. This is spiritual revelation. And if we stop here, if we only feel shock and then walk away, we will have done nothing. We will have become complicit in the very betrayal we condemn. So we must go deeper now and truly ask, what does it all mean? 1. It means we are spiritually orphaned south. Africa is not just in moral crisis. It is in spiritual exile. We were raised on house truths. We were nursed by false prophets. We were handed a father figure who was hollow inside. And now we wander like orphans without moral direction, without a sense of God, without a shared compass. The state is broken. Yes, but worse, the soul is unparented. This is what happens when a nation gives its trust to a man who refuses to kneel. 2. It means we are building on sand if the foundation is false. The house will collapse. Mandela is the foundation of modern South Africa's identity, its morality, its story. But what if that foundation is built on a carefully managed lie? If the Rainbow Nation was constructed not on righteousness, but on performance and denial, it means everything built on top laws, parliaments, education, memory is unstable. It means no progress will last because the root is sick. We must now admit we are building a future on the sand of narrative, not the rock of truth. 3. It means our pain has a source. We are not just unlucky. Our crime, our corruption, our failing, schools, our suicides, our fatherlessness, our chaos, these things have a cause. We are suffering because we have been cut off from truth, from spiritual structure, from moral inheritance. We are not just in a political problem. We are living under a false story. And false stories do more damage than bullets. They poison how we think. They redefine right and wrong. They numb the conscience. They normalize death. This is not random pain. This is engineered pain that began the moment we exchanged God for image, truth for myth, principle for power. 4. It means we must begin again. Go forward. We must go back. We must find the place where the lie entered and begin again from there. That place was when we decided to exalt Mandela above the truth. We cannot reform the nation by patching broken windows. We must rebuild the foundation stone by stone, word by word, child by child. It means revisiting our curriculums, our preambles, our heroes, our festivals, our national days, and asking, is this true? Or was it manufactured to keep us asleep? We must become a nation of memory restorers, not myth consumers. 5. It means we are responsible. Now here's the most uncomfortable truth of all. If you've read this far, you can no longer say, I didn't know. You now know the lie. You now see the spirit behind the politics. You now understand that Mandela was not the savior, but the smile on the serpent. So now you must decide. Do I stay silent? Do I keep pretending? Do I keep recycling slogans? Do I hand these lies to my children? Or do I become part of the remnant who rebuilds? You don't have to be a politician. You only have to be honest and courageous, because truth is lonely before it is popular. 6, it means the war. It's always been about the soulet. It's never just about land, never just about votes, never just about race. It was always a war for the soul. The soul of the ANC. The soul of the Constitution. The soul of education. The soul of memory. The soul of the nation. Mandela lost that war when he traded Christian truth for communist strategy. The ANC lost that war when it chose lies over legacy. But you don't have to lose. This is what it means. You now stand at the fork. You have been called into responsibility, and the nation cannot be healed by government only, by people who wake up. Final word, let it sink in. So, pause here. Don't rush to the next chapter. Don't go looking for the next villain. Don't get addicted to the drama. Just let this sink in. The man we trusted told the biggest lie of all. The nation we built stands on that lie, and we cannot be free until we tear it down. This is what it means. And once you understand this, your life can never go back to normal, nor should it. The serpent's method from Eden to the ANC. The Luciferian techniques of infiltration is not a modern invention. It is as old as Eden, as ancient as the first lie ever whispered. And it was never about brute force, it was about seduction. Did God really say? Q. Genesis 3:2-1. That was the first strategy of Lucifer. Not to strike with lightning, but to question, not to terrorize. Q. But to soften, not to oppose, but to infiltrate. Not to destroy from the outside, but to redefine truth from within. And this same ancient strategy, taught in the shadows of Moscow, was perfected in the political laboratories of the 20th century and exported through a quiet weapon of world revolution, the Lenin School for Party Cadres. The Lenin School, Satan's classroom in modern times, founded in 1926 in the Soviet Union. The Lenin School was not a place of academic debate. It was an indoctrination camp for global takeover. It trained men not in warfare of guns, but warfare of language, psychology, emotion, and memory. Its graduates were not soldiers. They were engineered minds specially trained to infiltrate foreign movements, reshape their values, collapse their moral centers, and repurpose them for global communist revolution. And among its most strategic missions, infiltrate the ANC. Turn it from a Christian moral liberation movement into a Marxist vanguard. Turn pastors into propagandists. Turn prayers into slogans. Turn the pulpit into the podium of revolution. And it worked. But how? Not with blood at first, but with the exact tools Lucifer used in Eden. 1. So doubt in the sacred. Did God really say? Lucifer didn't begin by attacking God. He began by planting intellectual doubt. He questioned the clarity of truth. He rebranded obedience as oppression. And the Lenin-trained infiltrators did the same. They entered the ANC and said, is Christianity really helping us? Is turning the other cheek not just a way to stay weak? Isn't nonviolence just pacification? What if the Bible is a colonial tool? Maybe revolution is more righteous than religion. Just like in Eden, they made the forbidden fruit look noble. 2. Rebrand evil as wisdom. You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. Genesis 3:4-5. Lucifer told Eve that rebellion was not sin, it was enlightenment. Disobedience wasn't evil, it was empowerment. The Leninists did the same. They redefined violent struggle as righteous resistance. They called communism scientific socialism. They called party indoctrination critical consciousness. They called moral compromise necessary for the movement. They wrapped death in the language of destiny. 3. Separate the movement from its founders. This was made to forget the intimacy she had with her creator. The serpent disrupted her memory. He replaced her relational trust with analytical suspicion. So too, the Leninists in the ANC made the new generation forget the spirit of John Dube, the man of mission schools and scripture, Sol Plaatje, the Bible translator and poet, Sefo Ko Makwutho, the unifier of black faith and black dignity. They were mocked as outdated, too passive, irrelevant. The Serpent convinced the ANC that the men who had birthed it in prayer were weak, and once memory was severed, anything could be installed. For infiltrate. Not attack. Lucifer did not attack Eden from the outside. He slithered inside. He blended with the environment. He made himself appear harmless. He spoke like a friend. He came close. That's the strategy of ideological possession. Don't strike, sneak. That's what the Leninists did. They didn't create a new party. They infiltrated the ANC from within. They didn't destroy Christianity directly. They reframed it, stripped it of its holiness. Made it a side dish to revolution, and used it only when it served the cause. The enemy wore the uniform of the trusted. 5. Offer a shortcut to glory. Lucifer promised Eve godhood without obedience. He said, you can be like God knowing good and evil. The Leninists said the same. You can have justice without forgiveness. You can have equality without personal responsibility. You can build a nation without God. Offered heaven on earth through revolution, slogans, committees, and 5-year plans. Just like Eden, it sounded perfect. Until the country collapsed. The result? Eden burned. The ANC hollowed the Garden of Eden was lost, not by war, but by spiritual seduction. The ANC's Christian soul was not destroyed by external force, but by internal infiltration. That is the parallel. That is the terrifying truth. Both Eden and the ANC fell. Because someone trusted a lie dressed in wisdom, and the people paid the price. South Africa is still eating the fruit to this day. South Africa eats from that same tree. The tree of race blame, the tree of historical denial, the tree of party worship, the tree of Mandela-myth, the tree of rebellion disguised as liberation. And just like Adam and Eve, you're now hiding in shame, naked, confused, and blaming one another. Chapter 10. The Camouflage Doctrine. How Mandela Mastered Lenin's Most Lethal Lesson. A. Piercing analysis of how Nelson Mandela absorbed and applied the Leninist principle of camouflage. Not only politically, but spiritually and personally. Drawing from Mandela's public contradictions, private alliances, and crafted persona. This chapter reveals how the greatest deception was not his ideology, but his ability to conceal it beneath robes of peace, tolerance, and moral high ground. Among the most dangerous modules taught at the International Lenin School in Moscow, one stood out above all others. It was not sabotage, not armed insurrection, not economic destabilization. It was this: camouflage, not the military kind, the spiritual kind, the ideological kind, the kind that hides the serpent in the priest's robe, the kind that does not conquer through confrontation but convinces through concealment. The Soviets taught it to their most trusted recruits, and Nelson Mandela perfected it. The camouflage doctrine. Soviet-style, the Lenin School taught that for communism to survive and spread in foreign lands, it could not arrive as communism. It had to wear the face of the local culture, speak the language of the people, co-opt the symbols of the oppressed, and dress itself in robes of morality. It must infiltrate churches, liberation movements, academic institutions, not with red flags, but with words like justice, peace, and unity. It must never say, we will destroy your God. It must say, we want equality for all. It must not declare, we follow Marx. It must say, we are here for the people. And no one embodied this camouflage doctrine better than Nelson Mandela. Mandela, the mask, the split between private belief and public image. To understand the power of Mandela's camouflage, you must hold two pictures in your mind: Mandela the public Christian, quoting scripture, praying beside tutu, attending church services, speaking of reconciliation, wearing the robe of peace. Mandela, the trained Marxist trained in covert operations, infiltrated and overtook the ANC's Christian moral structure, allied with Fidel Castro, Muammar Gaddafi, and the Soviet bloc, defended violence as a necessary path, rejected any mention of God. In the Constitution, one face to the world, another to the revolution. Camouflage in his speeches. Mandela's genius was his language. He spoke with calculated vagueness, always enough to comfort the West, yet never betraying his loyalty to the communist agenda. He used Christian vocabulary, but never Christian accountability. He used the word peace, but refused to condemn the terror inflicted in the name of the ANC. He spoke of human dignity, but remained silent as the ANC necklaced hundreds in the townships. He quoted Gandhi to Europe and praised Castro to the Third World. This was not inconsistency. This was camouflage. Camouflage in Elias Mandela's friendship circle reveals the truth behind the mask. Joe Slovo, the hardline white communist strategist of the ANC. Moses Kotane, the architect of ANC's ACP unification. Fidel Castro, a brutal dictator. Yasser Arafat, leader of violent nationalist resistance. Muammar Gaddafi, an anti-Western autocrat. These were not accidents. These were ideological brothers. But Mandela knew he could not sell their values to a Western audience, so he camouflaged them with rhetoric, always speaking of tolerance and inclusivity, while spiritually marching under a red banner. Camouflage in the Constitution, one of the most symbolic acts of Mandela's camouflage. Mastery was his vehement opposition to including God in the 1996 Constitution. To the cameras, he stood as a unifier. To the people, he smiled as a freedom father. To the world, he knelt beside a bishop. But when Archbishop Desmond Tutu proposed that the Constitution begin with "in the name of God," Mandela turned cold, combative, and forceful. "No," he said, "this is a secular state." This was not neutrality. This was a final burial of the Christian soul of the ANC. Dawn in daylight. Under the cover of constitutional progress, camouflage. As national strategy, Mandela did not just practice camouflage personally. He institutionalized it. The ANC, under his influence, learned that image trumps reality. Corruption could be forgiven if the right speech followed. Failures could be whitewashed with slogans. State collapse could be ignored. The branding was strong. The movement didn't need to fix anything. It just needed to camouflage everything. Collapse, escom, say transformation. Fail, education, say decolonizing the curriculum. Steal, billions, say radical economic justice. Kill, whistleblowers, say factional divisions. This is not just incompetence. This is the camouflage doctrine perfected from Lenin's classroom. To South Africa's collapse, the poison began at the Lenin School. But it flowed through Mandela's pen. It entered parliament. It infected media. It conquered education. It seduced the youth. It rewrote memory. It swallowed the church, and all the while, it was wrapped in a flag and a smile. The greatest camouflage, making the world love him in the end. Mandela's most profound camouflage achievement was this. He convinced the world that he was the light while walking in shadow. He walked into history as a moral icon, but he left behind a legacy of deception. And because of his camouflage, no one dared question the rot. No one examined the contradictions. No one called him what he had become: the architect of moral confusion, the father of national camouflage. Final word: unmask or be destroyed. Camouflage. It's not harmless. It infects nations. It blinds generations. It creates idols instead of ideas. It breeds spectacle instead of substance. And it is now our national disease. South Africa is a country full of camouflaged politicians, camouflaged policies, camouflaged corruption, and camouflaged faith. And unless we name the lie and rip off the mask, the house will fall completely. Asterisk, Chapter 11, Moses. Katane's bishop, who baptized Nelson Mandela and the architect of ANC's ACP. Unification. This chapter traces the critical role Moses Katane played as the ideological high priest of the ANC's transformation from a Christian liberation movement into a Marxist political machine. It presents Katane not as a footnote, but as the unacknowledged godfather of the ANC's spiritual betrayal and Mandela's political coming voyage. Every church has its founding apostles. Every revolution has its hidden priests, and every betrayal begins not with thunder, but with a whisper behind the curtain in the spiritual collapse of the African National Congress's fall from Christian roots into communist corruption. One man stands as the quiet bridge, the shadow priest, the true architect of the great transformation. His name was Moses Kotane, and though his name does not echo in liberation songs or Hollywood films, he was the man who baptized Nelson Mandela not into the Church of Christ, but into the Church of Marx. The forgotten bishop of the revolution. Moses Katane was not a bishop in robe and stole. He was a bishop of ideology, where John Dube baptized the ANC in scripture and Christian conscience. Moses Katane rebaptized it in the blood-stained waters of Leninism. He was the man who made sure that the Bible was replaced by Das Capito. The pastor was replaced by the party operative. The hymn was replaced by the militant chant. The Church of Truth was replaced by the cult of revolution. If Mandela was the public face of transformation, Katane was the surgeon who rewired the soul. Katane's mission married the ANC to the Communist Party. It is impossible to understand what the ANC became without understanding what Katane planned. He joined the South African Communist Party, SACP, in 1928, quickly rose through the ranks, and by the 1930s was sitting at the ideological epicenter of Sovietine revolution in Africa. But Katane knew that the SACP by itself could never rule South Africa. Too foreign. Too white. Too openly atheist. Too radical. So he proposed a merger, not on paper, but in spirit. Infiltrate the ANC. Guide its young lions. Convert its mission schools into Marxist training grounds. Replace prayer with propaganda. Erase Christian conscience. But keep the language of justice. Subvert from within. This was not a political strategy. It was a spiritual takeover, and Katane executed it with surgical brilliance. Mandela, the disciple Nelson Mandela, met Katane in the 1940s. When he was still forming his political identity, he had come from the royal houses of the Allora. He had attended Methodist institutions. He had been married to Evelyn Mays, a devout Christian. But Mandela was discontent. He wanted something harder, sharper, more militant. Enter Moses Kotane, showed him a path, one that didn't rely on prayer, one that didn't wait for moral change, one that used force, revolution, and global Marxist networks. Mandela never looked back. He broke from Evelyn, he severed his Methodist roots, and he walked into the baptismal waters of communist doctrine. Guided by the hand of Kotane, did not just influence Mandela, he discipled him. The true ANC's ACP merger was spiritual. Not administrative. History books often refer to the tripartite alliance between the ANC's SACP and COSATU as though it were a convenient political coalition. But the real merger came long before those conferences and declarations. It came the moment Katane began training ANC youth in SACP doctrine, embedding communist cells into ANC structures, and turning the ANC's moral bloodstream from Christian red to Marxist black. By the 1950s, the ANC was no longer the movement of Dube or PLA-TJE. It had become a vessel of Leninist revolution, still using the language of African liberation, but now emptied of its Christian soul. Katane's final victory, the quiet erasure of Godin, the 1960s. As the ANC went underground and MK was formed, Moses Kotane watched from the shadows. Churches were now seen as reactionary. Christian leaders were pushed aside. The movement became military. Chapter 13. No excuse for the path he chose. Definitive moral judgment. This chapter confronts the lazy apologists who excuse Mandela's embrace of violence as necessary or unavoidable, and exposes that he had alternatives clear, tested, and right before him. It draws from the example of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Christian founders of the ANC to dismantle the myth that Mandela was forced into violent revolution. It asserts with clarity, he chose it, and he must answer for it. History does not happen in a vacuum. Leaders are never without examples. Decisions are never made in total. Darkness. Every generation has before it the road of righteousness and the road of destruction. And Nelson Mandela contrary to myth was not trapped. He had choices. He had light. He had living models of nonviolent resistance before his eyes. And he chose the gun. He chose the bomb. He chose the necklace. He chose the training camps. He chose the ideology of force. Let history record it plain. The violence was not forced on him. He reached for it. Gandhi was there when Mandela was born in 1918. Mahatma Gandhi had already lived more than 20 years in South Africa. Gandhi's political awakening, strategy of civil disobedience, and philosophy of nonviolent resistance were all shaped and sharpened on South African soil. He was arrested in South Africa. He led strikes in South Africa. He faced racial humiliation in South Africa. He stood against unjust laws in South Africa. And through all of it, he never chose the bullet. He taught Satyagraha the idea that truth and moral courage could outlast oppression. He trained Indians in spiritual discipline. He organized marches. He suffered willingly, and Gandhi's legacy was not hidden. He was a national figure, a global symbol, a household name, and Mandela knew of him. He later even claimed Gandhi as a spiritual ancestor. But if that were true, why did he choose the opposite path? Martin Luther King was there while Mandela was rising in the ANC Youth League and forming Umkhonto we Sized in the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King Jr. was thundering against injustice in America. He walked into fire hoses. He marched into bullets. He stood in front of riot police, and he refused to lift a finger in retaliation. King said violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. Mandela heard of him. He knew the model. He read the headlines. He heard the speeches, and he chose a different spirit. He chose the spirit of Lenin. Not Christ. The founders of the ANC were there above. All this is the greatest indictment. Mandela was not a lost man in a wilderness of no role models. He was operating from within a Christian movement. He was not leading a secular, revolutionary party. He was born into the house of John Dube, a preacher of the gospel, Sefako Magutho, a Methodist Christian unifier, Sol Plaatje, a Bible translator and moral poet, Walter Rubusana, a spiritual educator and churchman, Pixley C.A., Seam, an articulator of African Christian values. Men who would have rather died than ordered mob justice. Men who believed in God's timing, not the shortcut of terror. Men who prayed, not plotted. Men who believed that the ANC's power came from its soul, not its slogans. And Mandela had access to their writings, their minutes, their speeches, their faith, and still he went the other way. He knew better. He had light. He had examples. And he still reached for the fire. You cannot say the sun must rise in the south too excuse. Mandela's path is to twist the laws of moral gravity. It is to say that wrong was right, that evil was necessary, that lies are acceptable, spoken with a smile, that the sun must now rise from the south, 'cause Mandela said so. It is the equivalent of saying Christian men must now preach murder. Bibles can now be used as shields for bombs. Churches can now be battlegrounds. To defend Mandela's choices is to declare that history no longer matters, that faith no longer binds, and that violence can be righteous if the right man authorizes it. No, he chose, and he must. Let there be no confusion. The ANC was once a house of peace. Mandela turned it into a fortress of blood, and he did so with eyes wide open. He was not an ignorant man. He was not desperate. He was not surrounded only by violence. He was surrounded by Christian men of character, by living examples of peaceful revolution, by a clear moral inheritance, and he threw it away. He chose Moscow over the mission. School, he chose the bullet over the Bible. He chose the power of myth over the humility of truth. Final word, there is no justification for betrayal. There comes a moment in every nation's life when it must decide, will we excuse our heroes or will we hold them to the truth? Mandela was not an uninformed man. He was surrounded by light and he walked into shadow. He could have been a second Gandhi. Chapter 14 of Lies and Secrets. The hidden chamber of Mandela and Tambo. This chapter pulls back the curtain on the culture of secrecy that saturated the ANC under Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo. Brotherhood that spoke the language of justice publicly, but concealed the killings, betrayals, and silenced consciences inside the movement. It reveals how secrecy itself became a political weapon, and how both men, smiling and dignified, carried dark truths to the grave. There are the lies that are told, and then there are the lies that are lived south. Africa was not only built on broken promises and deception, it was built on secrets dark, heavy, deliberate secrets carried by men who the world celebrated as moral giants. Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo were not just symbols of struggle, they were guardians of silence. Behind the smile, behind the speeches, behind the global admiration, there was a closed door. Behind that door were comrades killed by comrades, informants tortured by the movement that claimed to fight for justice, internal purges, brutality, and cover-ups. And those secrets were never confessed. They were buried. And South Africa, glowing with the light of false peace, was built on that burial ground. Mandela, the keeper of strategic silence, Nelson Mandela, knew. He knew what was happening. In the ANC camps, he knew about Quatro, the ANC's secret prison in Angola. He knew that comrades were being beaten, tortured, starved, accused without trial, buried in unmarked graves, executed for suspicion, alone. But he never said a word, even after his release, even as he became president, even when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission invited honesty. Remained quiet. He spoke of the crimes of apartheid, but never of the crimes within the apartheid. Never of the betrayals, never of the dead comrades who would never come home. Why? Because the myth was more important than the memory. Because truth would have cracked the foundation. Because justice would have shattered the legacy. So he kept the secret, and the lie lived on. Tambo, the silent overseer of blood. Oliver Tambo, dignified, eloquent, gentle, was Mandela's twin in myth. But behind the curtain, Tambo was more than just a figurehead in exile. He was the administrator of the ANC's external operations, the man who managed the camps, the man who authorized the intelligence structures, and the man who knew who was being beaten and why. Tambo presided over the rise of paranoia in the camps, the brutal treatment of suspected informants, the unchecked power of the ANC's security wing, Bakodo, the political purges inside the exile movement. Many comrades disappeared under his watch. And what did he say? Nothing. He returned to South Africa as a hero. He was hailed as a father of the nation, but the cries of the tortured in an NC detention camps never passed his lips. He, too, kept the secret. He, too, allowed the lie to breathe. Truth was not omitted. Was erased. This was not oversight. It was strategy. Both Mandela and Tambo knew that. If the people knew the full truth, the ANC would lose its spiritual credibility. If the West knew about the killings, the funding would stop. If the youth knew how the ANC treated its own, the illusion of moral superiority would collapse, so they consciously buried the truth. The TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was carefully stage-managed. Only certain crimes were acknowledged, only certain victims were named. The rest disappeared into the darkness of official, FORGETFULNESS. Mandela never wept publicly for those killed by ANC hands. Tambo never repented before his death. Their silence was not dignified, it was damning. The lie becomes national culture because the leaders held secrets. The people learned to live with lies. The ANC learned to justify corruption, excuse assassinations, smother whistleblowers. Control media, rewrite history. The culture of secrecy became a governance strategy. Files disappeared, investigations stalled, classified became the magic word. Whistleblowers died mysteriously. And it all began with the first generation of secret dashkeepers. The fathers of the Republic taught the sons how to lie. Final word until the secrets are named. The soul remains sick. South Africa cannot heal from what it refuses to name. Mandela's silence was not peacekeeping. Tambo's silence was not diplomacy. Their silence was betrayal. They let the lie grow. They let the secrets fester. And today, the republic they helped build is governed by men who learned the same lesson. Protect the party, bury the truth. Preserve the image. Forget the dead. But we have not forgotten. We remember. QUATRO. We remember the necklac INGS. We remember the cries inside the camps. We remember the unmarked graves. We remember the men who died by the hands of their brothers. He could have been a Black Martin Luther King. He could have led the ANC into a revival of spiritual courage. Instead, he led it into a war of camouflage, corruption, and moral decay. And no applause can cover that. No statue can redeem it. No slogan can erase it. The path of violence was not forced. It was chosen. And those who chose it must answer to history and to God. Asterisk. Chapter 17. The Mountain of Renewal. South Africa's Mount Sinai moment. A new covenant, not of politics, but of sacred law. You cannot leave Egypt without building something new. An exodus demands a covenant. A departure demands a direction. And a broken people need a mountain, a place where they meet truth again. Not as propaganda, but as sacred law. In biblical times, after escaping the iron grip of Pharaoh, the Israelites didn't go straight to prosperity. They went to Mount Sinai. They went to hear from God, not from committees, not from majority votes, not from Mafafis tolls. And South Africa, too, must come to its Mount Sinai after the ANC. After the lies. After the violence. After the betrayal. There must be a sacred pause. Not to reboot politics, but to rebuild the soul. What is the Mount Sinai of a nation? It is a return to the source. It is the place where truth is not negotiable. Moral law is supreme. Human dignity is sacred. Power bows before principle. The people remember who they are. We do not need more policies. We need commandments, not commandments in stone, but commandments in conscience. The new covenant for South Africa here. At this symbolic Sinai, South Africa must write a new covenant, not a constitution from Marxist lawyers, not a manifesto from Soviet-trained comrades, but a covenant, born from the soil, soul, and sacred longing of the people. Let it be etched, not in ink, but in fire and truth. 1. You shall have no other gods, especially the party. The ANC made itself God. People prayed to it for jobs, for food, for hope. This must end. Never again must any party rise above the people or above the truth. 2. You shall not kill your own people in the name of revolution. No more necklac INGS. No more assassinations. No more comrades killing comrades for factional power. Life is sacred again. 3. You shall not steal, especially in the name of the poor. Corruption is not. Liberation economics. The poor were not liberated. They were looted. From now. Theft is treason. And virtue is value. 4. You shall honor your elders, not erase them from history. The ANC erased John Dube, Sol Plaatje, and Makwatho from its DNA. The new South Africa must restore its true fathers, honor the African Christian legacy, not the imported Marxist. Poison. 5. You shall remember the Sabbath not for religion, but for reflection. A nation that never stops to reflect will run itself to ruin. Silence, prayer, reflection, community must be restored. South Africa must learn to pause and remember its purpose. From Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. Mount Sinai was not the destination, it was the renewal point, the place where slaves became a nation. South Africa is still in the wilderness, but if we find our moral compass, we will find our way, not by economic plans alone, not by slogans, not by new political parties, but by moral clarity, spiritual courage, and a shared oath. We will no longer serve the serpent. We will no longer glorify lies. We will live by truth, or we will not live at all. Final word. The sound of the trumpet in Mount Sinai. It is written. A trumpet sounded, a long blast that shook the mountains. That trumpet must sound again in South Africa. It is the trumpet of awakening, of remembrance, of judgment and hope. Let it ring through the valleys of Alexandra, the hills of KwaZulu, the plains of the Karoo, the towers of Johannesburg, the vineyards of the Cape. The time of lies is over. The Exodus has begun. The covenant has been written, and we are going home. Chapter 18. Rebuilding from the ashes, a practical path to resurrection economically, culturally, spiritually. You cannot just curse the ruins and walk away. A prophet who only shouts at the flames but never builds the temple is no prophet at all. We have named the serpent. We have walked out of Egypt. We have stood at the mountain. Now we must build again. South Africa. It's not beyond repair. Its heart still beats. Its people still rise early. Still hustle. Still hope. And hope is not a feeling, it is fuel. But that hope must now take form. It must put on boots, grab tools, write visions, train hands, dig, sow, craft, pre-and, build. 1. Rebuilding economically. The revival of honest industry. The economic system of South Africa has been rotted by cadre deployment, tender cartels, and looting as lifestyle. We must now shift from entitlement to enterprise, from state capture to self-reliance, from slogans to skills. Reconstruction begins with the return of honest work. The path forward: micro-enterprise zones in townships, backyard businesses, Spaza to Silicon Dreams, garage factories, rooftop farms. Skill-based schools, welding, plumbing, coding, mechanics, not fake degrees, but real value. Local capital models, stockpiles, community banks, ownerships. Ownership is the new revolution. Protect and reward producers, whether a woman making bricks or a man repairing tires. Production is national service. We must lift up the builder over the bureaucrat, the farmer over the police or drafter, the technician over the talker. Our economy will not rise from speeches, but from soil, steel, and sweat. Point 2. Rebuilding culturally, restoring the soul of the people. The culture of South Africa has been hijacked by gangsterism, noise, sexual chaos, and fake fame. We have been taught that to be African is to be angry, violent, dependent, or shameless. That lie must be crushed. We must resurrect true African dignity rooted in Ubuntu. Not comradeship, respect, not party obedience, ancestral honor, not ancestral manipulation. Language revival, not imported slogans, family strength. Not fatherless mobs. Township pride, not township decay. Let us rebuild our identity through art that heals, not degrades, through music that uplifts, not NUMBs. Through dress that dignifies, not vulgarizes, through stories that remember. Not distort. Culture is not decoration, is the womb of a people. If the culture is diseased, the people will miscarry their own future. 3. Rebuilding spiritually. A return to truth and conscience. Final pillar of resurrection is spiritual. Restoration, not religion as institution, but faith as fire, conscience as compass, truth as altar. The Ankh killed the conscience of the nation. They normalized lying, stealing, killing, so long as it was for the people. We must now revive the holy shame, the sacred no, and the moral yes. We must rebuild our lives not around political parties, but around timeless values. What does this look like? Men who fear God more than political bosses. Women who raise children, not to chant, but to reason. Youth who open books instead of burning buildings. Churches that speak truth even when it's unpopular. Mosques. And temples that choose integrity over identity. Let there rise a spiritual revolution of conscience. Quiet. Unbending. Unstoppable. Final word. The blueprint in our hands, we have the blueprint. It is not new, it is not foreign. It is written in the memory of every grandmother, every teacher, every honest artisan who never stole a cent. South Africa does not need to import greatness. It needs to resurrect it, not through foreign aid, but through faithful labor, not through elections, but through conscience, not through fantasies of equality, but through the dignity of earned success, not through hatred of the past, but through the resurrection of its truest values. The serpent is behind us. The fire is before us. Let us now build a nation of fireproof souls, stone by stone, family by family, truth by truth. This is the real revolution. Chapter 19, the Declaration of the New South. African soul, a creed for a people reborn from fire and truth. There comes a time when a people must draw a line, not on paper, not with votes, but in the soul. After betrayal, after mourning, after exile, people must speak again. Not slogans, not manifestos, but a creed, a declaration of who we are, what we will no longer tolerate, and what we will become. South Africa stands at such a threshold. This declaration is not from a government, not from a movement, but from the spirit of the people, who remember and who refuse to forget what dignity is. We, the children of this soil, declare 1. That we are not a product of the ANC, but of God in history. We were not born in 1994. We are not a footnote in a party's victory. We are a people ancient, rooted, crafted by struggle, prayer, labor, and providence. Our destiny is not owned by cadres. We belong to God, to truth, to justice, not to politicians. 2. That lies shall no longer govern our lives. We renounce the lies told in textbooks, in boardrooms, in Parliament. We reject the rewriting of history by those who have blood on their hands and speeches on their lips. We name the serpent for what it, a liar from the beginning. We choose memory over propaganda. We choose truth over comfort. 3. That work is holy, and entitlement is a curse. We no longer kneel before handouts. We reject the politics of dependency. We crown the farmer, the builder, the mechanic, the nurse, those who produce, who heal, who feed. Our wealth will not be voted into existence. Will be built with our hands. 4. That our children will be raised in truth, not party allegiance. We shall raise a generation unbrainwashed. Children who know John Dube, Macrotho Sol Plaatje, only Mandela. Children who do not fear to question, to reason, to dream beyond party lines. Let the next generation carry books, not party T-shirts. Let them chant conscience, not COMRADESHIP. 5. That God is not a metaphor, but the author of nations. We affirm the divine, not in slogans, but in silence, in reverence. In the breath between words, we name the name that the preamble of our Constitution rejected. We are the people of God. He could have been a Black Martin. Luther King, he could have led the ANC into a revival of spiritual courage. Instead, he led it into a war of camouflage corruption and moral decay. And no applause can cover that. No statue can redeem it. No slogan can erase it. The path of violence was not forced, it was chosen, and those who chose it must answer to history and to God. Asterisk.